Hey everyone, thanks for checking back in for another video. Today's concept I'm really excited to talk about. What I'm talking about today has been hugely helpful to me in multiple areas, and I'm hoping it's going to be really helpful for you as well as we look at some core concepts around how the brain works and neuroscience. And I titled this, and it's really an appropriate title. Sometimes you really should just ignore the thoughts that are coming up. Sometimes our brain, and by the way, our brain is essentially just a thought-generating machine. I mean, our brain does a lot, but part of one of its functions is that it's constantly generating thoughts. And some of these thoughts are good, and some of these thoughts really we should just ignore. What I found in my life, and maybe you can resonate with this, is that I get into trouble when I assume that every thought coming up from my brain is coming from like a true, deeper part of me. If I agree with every thought that's coming up, or I think it's supposed to happen, or it's coming from my higher self, my spiritual self, then I can get a lot of pain from that. So what I'm learning to do over time is that we actually have the ability, and I have the ability, to decide which thoughts I'm going to focus on and which thoughts I should actually reject. I have what's kind of called a veto power over thoughts. I can't control what initially comes up. I can't control what grabs my brain's attention. I can't control what my brain takes as a threat or as something I need to be made aware of. But I absolutely have some autonomy, some control over what I will choose to focus on. And as we learn a little bit about how the brain works, and I want to explain a couple of concepts to you, we'll see more and more why this is so important about where we pay attention and where we put our focus, because it actually has an impact on aspects of our physical brain, which kind of blows my mind as I think about that. But I'm also kind of a neuroscience geek, so it may not affect you in the same way. But let me start by explaining a few concepts here related to the brain. The first concept is what we call Hebbs Law. And what Hebbs Law says is essentially that neurons that fire together wire together. And the way that the brain and our nervous system works, and we have neurons in all over our body and kind of clustered in some areas of our body, but when we have a thought, when we have an impulse, it's usually these networks of neurons that are firing together. They don't even really touch. They just kind of send chemical transmitters in between them. But the more that happens between two particular neurons, it strengthens their connection. Kind of like strands being added to a rope. So neurons that fire more together, they get stronger. So that's key concept number one. The next concept is what's called the quantum Zeno effect. Kind of as an FYI, a lot of these concepts and things I'll be presenting, they're from a book called You Are Not Your Brain. I believe it's called You Are Not Your Brain by Jeffrey Schwartz. Excellent book. And Dr. Schwartz has written about a lot of other things related to the brain and neuroscience if you want to look at that, and we can put a link in the beneath this video here. But the other concept that's important is called the quantum Zeno effect. And what that means is that whatever we focus on kind of seems to stabilize that neural pathway, that network in our brain for Hebbs Law to take effect. So if I get a thought that, wow, I think I really just sounded dumb saying that, the more I actually focus on whether that happened, I'm directing attention towards it. And in the world of quantum physics, in some weird kind of way, that tends to stabilize neurons so that Hebbs Law can take effect. So what I pay attention to and what I focus on gives my brain a chance to actually strengthen that even more, which ironically increases the chance that I'm going to have that same thought in the future. So those are the key things here, and they all kind of fall under this umbrella of what we call self-directed neuroplasticity. Now, I'm going to say it again, that's kind of a long term. Self-directed neuroplasticity. Neuroplasticity is a sense that our brains are actually not fixed, they're much more plastic. They're They are wiring and rewiring and pruning really throughout our whole life, although it doesn't happen quite as much as when we're younger as when we age. And then self-directed is how we participate in that process, how we direct our brains, whether passively or actively, around how they're going to wire and what networks are going to become weakened and what networks are going to become stronger. So a couple of applications around where this is important. The first one is a lot of times we get some fear that comes up. So I gave the example, we may have a conversation and maybe we got a look from that person that we didn't really know what that meant. Or maybe we're registering it as like, oh, I think they really thought I sounded not smart, or I think maybe they're kind of mocking me. That thought's going to come up. We can't control that. Our brain's trying to send you some sort of warning that like you may be under threat or something bad could happen. Perhaps this connects into something in your past that resembles that. And so our brains are just doing their job to try to give you the initial warning about it. But once we become aware of that thought, then we have to decide what to do with it. And sometimes we can ruminate on it. We go over the conversation over and over in our head, and we try to think about all the nuances and, wait, did I say that? Should I have said that? And do you see how when we are actually ruminating and we're going over it again and again, we're putting the quantum Zeno effect into play. We're giving attention to the situation, and we are actually inadvertently strengthening the pathway that is connected to that thought, to that fear. And a lot of times it's kind of for naught. We can't change a lot of times what happens. So this thought comes up. We have a lot of times an emotional response to it. Sometimes we, like I said, we replay that conversation. We think it somehow gets registered as like a threat to our safety or to the relationship. And then sometimes our body will generate uncomfortable emotions or even adrenaline or whatever the case may be. We can't necessarily manage that once that cycle happens, but we try to by going through the conversation over and over again or thinking about it. And those aren't effective ways to deal with that. We can talk about what could work with that. So in that situation, the best thing to do is to just try to ignore it and refocus. So we first try to kind of understand what's going on. So, okay, this is my brain. This isn't necessarily coming from my higher self, my true self. This is a thought from my brain. I can relabel this as something that maybe isn't totally true. Maybe I'm creating a story about that. But then the most important thing is to refocus and redirect. A lot of times we are trying to stay in that situation or stay in that scenario to try to make ourselves feel better. And like I said, we're strengthening everything in the brain related to that. What we know is that it's really just best to just almost try to veto it, reject it, and then get busy doing something else. Now, when you do refocus, that sensation's not going to go away initially. It's going to linger. But eventually you will notice it will dissipate. Now, why is it important to do this? Because when we refocus onto something else, we're building a new neural pathway, and we're building a new connection around how we respond to these things. And the more we do the new action or the new pattern, the easier that will become in the future, and we're weakening what's happening with that with the previous memory. So that's one situation, and that can come up, many times in a day around things that are triggers and our interactions. That's one application of this I think is really powerful. And if you can just trust it and you can keep practicing, you will see that it works. It takes time. And so the real question is, can I refocus and get busy doing something else until that uncomfortableness subsides? So can I manage that? But again, if we think that we are supposed to address that uncomfortableness, if we think that's actually coming from our true self, if we don't think it's ever going to get better, then we would maybe go back to it and then ruminate and like mull it over and try to think about it, or worse yet, agree with it. Like maybe it is true what I'm thinking about myself. we need to refocus and then trust that that eventually will dissipate, and also over time it's going to happen less and it will be weaker. Another very common application of this would even be around cravings to medicate or numb ourselves, whether in serious ways or in small ways. But a lot of times the thought comes up, oh, like I want food, I want alcohol, something like that. And at that moment we can decide what to do. We can pay attention to it. Like why is that coming up? What would that be like? Go through scenarios, even engaging in trying to battle it. Like, no, I'm not going to do it. Or maybe I will, or not. Again, it's what's called attention density. You are focused your attention on that, and we're actually giving it strength. So what I encourage people to do is, again, we can't control the thought that came up, but immediately veto it. Don't pay attention to it, and then move on. Now, that might sound kind of weird, because in therapy we actually do want to get to the root of why those things come up, and there is work to be done around that, but sometimes we just don't know. The brain is going to do what it's going to do, and it's highly complex for as much as we think we know about it, and we do know a good amount, but it's highly complex, and sometimes thoughts just come up. So if a craving comes up, can I reject it and move on and not pay attention to it? And just keep doing that until it goes down. And again, as I'm working with clients, and even as I experiment myself, there's efficacy in this. It does tend to work. So that's a helpful tool we have. Okay, so to summarize all of this, I just meant, again, for this video to be encouraging, hopefully, we don't have to pay attention to our brain. And in fact, in some cases, we are accidentally paying too much attention to thoughts, shame messages, fears that come up. And unless it really is something that you have to kind of think about and to kind of unpack, okay, but for a lot of these things, we know what it's about. It's a nuisance, it brings us down, it changes our mood. So the best thing to do is just try to veto or reject it and then change our focus. And know that as you do that, you are in your own way engaging in this self-directed neuroplasticity. You're helping to shape and rewire some of the neural pathways that are built around how we function. And that should give us a lot of hope, because what we're doing is actually part of a process, and it is changing us, even if it feels hard in the moment. So with that, we'll sign off, and we'll be back pretty soon with another video. And again, thanks for watching these, and I hope you find them helpful.